All right, let's dive into one of the most complex relationships out there, India and Pakistan. We're going to unpack a fascinating interview between India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and podcaster Lex Fridman.
Interesting that Modi chose this platform. Lex Fridman really goes deep with some serious people. You've got Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, even former President Trump on there. It's not your typical diplomatic setting.
Exactly. This is a real conversation, not just a carefully worded statement or something. And it gets really raw when they talk about the 1947 partition. You think you know the history, but Modi's telling it firsthand, and it's just gut-wrenching. He talks about trains coming from Pakistan, just packed with wounded and dead people. It's just a horrifying picture of what that event cost in human lives.
And it really gets to why there's so much mistrust between India and Pakistan even now. You can't just erase something that traumatic from the collective memory. It's like their relationship is built on this foundation of a really disturbing event.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. But wasn't there, at least at the beginning, some hope that they could coexist peacefully?
Yeah, there was, and it's important to remember that because it makes the current situation even more tragic. But that hope fell apart quickly, and one of the big reasons is this idea of a proxy war. Basically, it's when two countries fight indirectly by backing different sides in other conflicts. And Modi straight up accuses Pakistan of waging this kind of war against India.
Okay, so help me get this. What evidence does Modi give for that? Because it's a pretty serious accusation to make.
Right. He points to Pakistan's support for militant groups that are active in the region. Remember when Osama bin Laden was found hiding out in Pakistan close to a military base? That was a wake-up call for a lot of people and gave a lot of weight to Modi's argument that Pakistan is, at the very least, ignoring terrorism, if not actively backing it.
But some people say that bin Laden being there doesn't automatically mean the state was involved, right? How strong is Modi's argument as a whole?
It's complicated for sure, but then you have groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, which have been involved in the Kashmir conflict, that also have alleged ties to Pakistan. So it adds to India's worries about security. It's not just one incident, but a pattern of activity that really raises questions.
So we're seeing how the partition, this historical trauma, connects to current anxieties and this idea of a proxy war.
Yeah.
It's not just ancient history. It's still shaping the political landscape today. What's interesting is that even with all of this, Modi has made attempts to improve relations with Pakistan.
Yeah, he made that surprise visit to Lahore back in 2015 to meet with the Prime Minister of Pakistan at the time, Nawaz Sharif. No one saw that coming. It seemed like a genuine effort to break the cycle and build some trust.
But then, if I'm remembering right, things kind of went south after that.
They did. Modi says that what followed was a string of betrayals and an increase in hostility. It really showed how deeply ingrained the suspicion is and how difficult it is to build lasting peace in that region. It's like taking 2 steps forward and then getting pushed back 3.
So this takes us to a big question. Can they ever really break this cycle of conflict?
That's the million-dollar question. What's fascinating is that even with all the history, all the animosity, there are these little sparks of hope, and one of those comes from a pretty unexpected place: cricket.
Okay, let's talk cricket.
Both India and Pakistan are crazy about cricket. It's more than just a sport there. It's a cultural obsession. And in the interview, you can tell how much Modi enjoys talking about it.
Yeah, he couldn't resist a little jab about India being better.
Yeah.
Right? But it's interesting because it shows how much the two cultures are intertwined, even with all the political tension.
Exactly. And that raises a good question. Does this shared cultural heritage make peace more likely because people have these connections? Or does it make the rivalry even stronger because it's like a battle for bragging rights? It really is a fascinating paradox. Shared passions, they can both bring people together and pull them apart. But going back to the interview, I think it's important to remember that even with Modi's hard line against Pakistan's alleged support for terrorism, he does acknowledge the human cost of this conflict. And on both sides.
Yeah, for sure. This is where we see a different side of Modi, I think, a more human side.
Yeah.
He talks about the innocent people in Pakistan who've also suffered because of all this, and you can really hear the sadness in his voice. It's a reminder that this isn't just some political game, you know. Real people, real families are caught in the middle of it.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder what it would take for both sides to finally put the well-being of their people ahead of politics and historical grievances. It's a question that kind of hangs over the whole conversation.
It really does. And it makes me think about how we often talk about these conflicts. We talk about India and Pakistan as if they're these single entities, but we forget about the millions of people in each country who might not agree with the main narrative.
That's so true. It's easy to fall into that us versus them trap, but the reality is way more complicated than that. There are peace activists, artists, just ordinary people on both sides working to bridge the gap. Their voices might not be as loud as the more aggressive ones, but they're there, and their efforts are really important.
So it's not completely hopeless then. There are people actively working for a more peaceful future.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this conversation so interesting. It's not just pointing fingers and dwelling on the past. Modi, even with all his criticisms of Pakistan, does say he has some hope that wiser minds will prevail and Pakistan will choose a path of reconciliation.
Okay, but being realistic, how likely is that? I mean, we've seen these glimmers of hope before, right? And they often lead to setbacks and more tension. What would have to happen for this time to be different?
That's the challenge, isn't it? It's like untangling this massive knot. There are so many layers, the history, the politics, the deep mistrust, the influence of other countries. But I think a really important factor is going to be whether both sides can acknowledge and deal with their own internal issues.
What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, Pakistan needs to face the issue of extremist groups operating within its borders. And India needs to address the concerns of its Muslim population, especially in Kashmir. Both countries need to create an environment where people can have dialogues, where they can disagree, where they feel safe to challenge the way things are.
So it's not just about diplomats and negotiations. It's about creating a fairer society within each country.
That's it exactly, because you can't force real peace from the outside. It has to come from within. And that requires a real change in how people think, a willingness to see the other side not as an enemy, but as another human being with their own hopes and fears and dreams.
That's a powerful idea. But how do you actually make that happen? How do you break down decades of prejudice and suspicion that are so deeply ingrained, it seems almost impossible?
It is incredibly difficult, but not impossible. Think about how much attitudes have changed towards LGBTQ plus rights in many parts of the world over the last few decades. That took a lot of grassroots activism, education, and people being willing to have some tough conversations. It wasn't easy, but it shows that change can happen.
So you're saying we need a similar kind of movement to change the relationship between India and Pakistan?
Yeah, I think so. It would take a real effort to challenge the stories that keep people afraid and divided, to see the humanity in the other side, and to build bridges of understanding.
And what can the rest of the world do to help with this?
The international community can offer support. They can encourage dialogue, help with peace-building projects, and hold both sides accountable for their actions. But in the end, the hard work has to come from India and Pakistan themselves.
It's a huge task, but it sounds like you're kind of optimistic.
I am, yeah. Because despite all the problems, I do see signs of hope. You have young people on both sides who are tired of the fighting and want to connect with each other. You have artists, musicians, writers, all using their talents to promote peace and understanding. And you have organizations that are working really hard to build connections across the border.
So even though the news might focus on the political tensions and military stuff, there's actually a lot more going on under the surface.
Absolutely. And it's really important for us to pay attention to those positive things, to give those voices for peace a platform, because they represent the best hope for a future where India and Pakistan can live peacefully together as neighbors.
So where does this leave us? What's the main takeaway for people listening who are trying to understand this complicated relationship?
The main thing is this. The relationship between India and Pakistan is complicated and always changing. It's like a tapestry woven together with threads of history, politics, culture, and human emotions. There are no easy answers, no quick solutions. But what we can do is try to understand all the different aspects, to question our own assumptions, and to stay open to the possibility of a more peaceful future.
I like that. Because in the end, isn't that what we all want? A world where these two countries, both with nuclear weapons, can figure out how to live together in peace. Where people on both sides can live without fear, and where maybe cricket can just be a game again. It is easy to get stuck on the negative stuff, all the conflict. But I like that you pointed out those bits of hope. It reminds us that change is possible, even when things seem really stuck.
It's important to hold on to that, yeah. And while those people-led efforts are crucial, we can't forget about the leaders themselves. One thing that really struck me in Modi's interview was how he talked about how the world sees this conflict. He said the world is finally recognizing where terrorism in the region really comes from.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement. But hasn't Pakistan also been hurt by terrorism? It seems a little too simple to just blame one side.
You're right, it's never that straightforward. Pakistan has suffered terribly from terrorism too. But Modi's point, and some international experts agree, is that Pakistan's support for certain militant groups, historically, has made the whole region more unstable.
So it's more about recognizing the complexities, seeing it from different angles, and not making these big generalizations.
Exactly. And to be fair to Modi, he does say that the people of Pakistan also want peace. He even expresses a little hope that Pakistan will choose to reconcile eventually.
That brings us back to the question we've been wrestling with this whole time. Can these two countries actually get past all that animosity and find a way to have peace? Or are they just stuck in this cycle of conflict?
That is the big question, right? And there are no easy answers, unfortunately, but I think the first step is just awareness. If we understand the history of the conflict, the political forces at work, and what people on both sides are going through, then we can start breaking down those walls of misunderstanding and prejudice.
And that's where things like citizen diplomacy, cultural exchanges, and cross-border projects come in, right?
Absolutely. Those efforts might seem small in the big picture, but they plant the seeds for empathy and understanding. They show that connection is possible, even when there's deep political division.
So the road to peace might be long and difficult, but it's not impossible.
Not at all, and I think that's the key message here. The situation is complex, there are no quick fixes, but there's still hope. As long as people on both sides are willing to reach out, to listen to each other, and to work together, there's a chance for India and Pakistan to have a better future.
Well said. And with that, we're wrapping up our deep dive into this fascinating and often frustrating relationship between India and Pakistan. We encourage you to keep learning about this, to seek out different points of view, and to have thoughtful discussions about the future of this really important region. Because building a more peaceful world is something we all have to do together, and it starts with each of us.